Hello, students. I am so excited to have somebody from not Denver, Colorado visiting with us today. I have Stacey Linch, who is actually in Phoenix, Arizona here to talk about this next subject. And she's actually going to do another subject a few modules down the road as well. So Stacey, let's just kick it off. Can you tell the students a little bit about yourself, maybe your education, your career background, and certainly where you work today and what you do?
Sure. Well, yeah. So I'm Stacey Linch. I am one of the deputy city auditors for the city of Phoenix. I have been with the city for about 17 years. Previous to the city, I worked in the financial industry, was a stay-at-home mom, different hodgepodge of things, but had a friend that worked in the city audit department. They said, you'd be great at it. I applied and I've never left. A lot of people say when you come to work for the city, there's the golden handcuffs of the pension. And then the city audit department, it's just such a fun place to work, if that makes sense. But for my education, I have my bachelor's degree in business administration. And I also have my master's of public administration. And I do have several audit related certifications. I'm a certified internal auditor, a certified information systems auditor. So lots of education. I'm very supportive of education, but my husband said I can't get my doctorate because he's not going to call me doctor. So
I love it. Well, I think we've had one of our guest speakers lifelong kind of learning was their advice or tip to students. So I like that you kind of do that as well, support that as well.
Yeah.
Any fun facts about yourself that you would want to share with the students before we jump in?
I probably have an unhealthy obsession to documentaries.
Ooh.
Anytime I say something about, oh, I saw this on TV, my coworkers, my friends, they know it was a documentary. And that probably should have let me know my career should have been in audit because I'm all about obtaining information. Now, granted, a lot of them are Dateline mysteries. So if anything happens to my husband, I've studied up on it and I probably can get away with it. No, just kidding.
Love it. You better be scared. No, I know you and I both have a passion for documentaries. That's probably why we get along so well. I'm always looking for those good fraud ones. So
yes.
Awesome. Well, we are here to talk about communicating and mainly communicating our audit engagement results. So we have already as a class talked about how do we plan for an engagement? How do we actually perform an engagement, do that testing? And I think you'll be such a great person to talk about the last stage, which is communicating. Now, we used to call this stage, I feel like, reporting, because that's really what we do. And I know you'll talk about that. But I also like the fact that instead of always saying like planning, field work, reporting, now we're doing kind of planning, performance, communicating, because it's the action of what we're doing versus the form at which we're doing it, if that makes sense. So I just wanted to kick off with really kind of more a high level question on what do you feel like is the biggest challenge in this area, in this phase of our audit engagements of communicating?
I mean, it's not just one thing, unfortunately. I think I can take it from two different perspectives. One is making sure you know who your target audience is. I mean, are you talking to the CEO of the company, the mayor of the city you work for, or is it the day-to-day person who's processing the invoices? Knowing your target audience and developing your communication approach that way. I'm very passionate about the different, books or courses you could take to effectively communicate with people and identifying based off of maybe their personality or their traits, how you can target your communication so they'll hear your message. Because auditing, there's a little bit of sales to it. We have to get their buy-in on potentially the audit recommendations we're going to be giving them. We have to get them to trust us so that they tell us all the secrets we need to know. So knowing how to communicate with the different individuals, knowing your target audience, I think is one challenge. But as an auditor, individually, when I'm going through all of my results, it's making sure that I've covered everything, because I'm going to go in and perform an audit on inventory management. And I'm going to cover all these different bases. And at the end, I've got to summarize that information. So making sure I'm covering everything throughout the audit, and I'm being transparent with the auditee and letting them know this is what I'm seeing. Am I understanding it correctly? Because that's just going to make it a better product in the end. So I think those are the two challenges that I see my staff having, challenges I've had throughout my career. So anything you can do through, whether it's practice or classes you could take to improve in those areas, I think it will help you.
Yeah, I love that. And I love what you picked there. I always used to interview audit staff and say, how comfortable are you being a salesperson? What sales experience do you have? And they kind of look at you like you have three heads for a minute. And then you explain that this is a lot of what we do. And, selling equals trust, trust equals selling. That whole cycle is super important. So yeah, I love that. And your second tip, what was going through my mind with not only being transparent in kind of what all we did, and thorough when we're communicating what we did and the results of that, it's also this fine balance of, we want to create this concise, very clear output that maybe doesn't always go into all the details. So it's like you're kind of walking this fine line of, and we're kind of getting into the communicating versus the method in which you're communicating, which is really the next question. I'd love for you to talk about how your team communicates those audit findings. So is it a report, memo, different formats depending on the type? Kind of go through that, because I think that's kind of the next big thing to talk about.
Yeah, you're right. It definitely feeds right into it, because you bring up the point about, we do so much work as auditors, but then we've got to get it down into this concise message. And I find that my staff, and I have in the past, we want to say in our audit reports or our memos, this is everything I did, but you really need to get to that point where it's like your 2-minute elevator speech. If they tell you to practice in your career. But in our office, I expect communication throughout the entire project, but when we get towards the end and we're done, we do have a more informal, what we call an exit meeting, where we're covering, this is the objective of the audit, this is what we found. We don't necessarily get into the point of talking about recommendations at that point. I mean, some of it's generally obvious. If they were never locking the safe where the cash was stored, we're going to give them a recommendation to do that. And then our staff go into the point where they're actually documenting it formally. So it could be a memo if it was what we call a non-audit service. So you have your audits where maybe you have very strong criteria, and then you have more of those consulting engagements, not audits. So those typically are in a memo. But if it's a traditional audit, it's going to be in a full audit report where we're covering all of the information, and then we will issue that in a draft format, the audit reports, because we want the city leadership to be able to look at it and make sure it's accurate. And then we come together in what we would call a closing meeting to get around the table, make sure there's no typos, make sure the information is accurate. And it's at that point that we're talking about the audit recommendations, and we're getting their concurrence on that. In some audit offices, they cannot concur with the recommendation, but in ours, they're kind of forced to concur. But that's why prior to in our communications, we're trying to get their buy-in, so that by the time we get to the closeout meeting, they should not be surprised on what we're telling them or what they read in the report.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something I know we'll talk about in the Agile module is, part of being Agile is that, it might not be as much as daily stand-up meetings with your audit clients, but maybe weekly, or, I used to have my team write weekly summary emails at the end, which was just very simply, a simple format of, here's what we accomplished this week, here's what we found, here's outstanding questions or things we need from your team. And it just really helped move the project along and keep that constant communication throughout, like you said.
Exactly. And working for a government body, we have that special aspect that everything we do is public record. So
Mhm.
we do post our audit reports to a public facing website where the average citizen, you yourself, could go and read our work. The only difference we have in some of those, if it's a confidential audit to where the information we were going to be talking about in the report could compromise the city. So for example, cybersecurity audits. We don't want to air our dirty laundry because then the bad guys could use it against us. So in those cases, we just have a very consolidated report. But I would like to see some different communication methods. I've seen some audit shops that have Twitter accounts or they're doing podcasts. So I think we have some room to grow, but for now, those are the methods we are taking.
Yeah, I think you brought up such a great point to distinguish government versus, a private or even a public entity, who that report goes to. So when Stacey started at the beginning, a lot of the communicating and remembering your audience, you really do based on the industry that you're in or the field that you're working in, you have to know what the audience is. And it's very different for government. It's everyone, literally.
Yeah.
And the media can get a hold of it. We've seen that over the years where they've poked at, at different city audit reports. So
Yeah.
you briefly kind of talked about how, maybe a cybersecurity audit would have different, components, language. It might be privileged or confidential, or privileged and confidential. What are the other components of a typical audit, like assurance report? I know, from my profession and my professional experience, it's background, you put in some scope, your objectives, and then you get into your findings, your recommendations. Sometimes it has action plans from management. What do yours look like?
Yeah, a lot of those same elements. We've kind of formatted our reports that again go to that targeted reader. So we have what we call the results in brief. This is just 2 or 3 quick bullets. And this is more for like the CEO, the mayors of the organizations that just have a quick amount of time. Okay, here's what we saw, very brief. And then we go into that traditional executive summary where again, it's just a little bit deeper and it keeps building into it. And then we have each of the individual audit reps, audit observations. And within that, we're putting in key elements, that background information. And in our office, we follow the federal government auditing standards yellow book. And when we are reporting our results, we have to include key elements that talk about, what was the criteria? What did we observe? What was the effect of what we saw? And then we have our audit recommendations that we include in there. At the point that our reports go out final, our auditee has already told us what they're going to do to remediate the issues we've identified. So they have their action plan that they put together and they come up with their target dates. So all of that information is available for anyone to see. And then we have, maybe that, legal wording in the back where we put some of the things in our report, like what was the scope we looked at, the time frame, what were our methodologies that we took, whether we did interviews or surveys or testing. We also include whether or not a statement on whether we found the data we used in our audit to be reliable. If we don't find the data be reliable, we need to call that out as a factor in that. And then stating whether or not we followed the government auditing standards when we perform the project. And 9 times out of 10, there's no issues there, but there are those instances where we have to say where we didn't follow the auditing standards, and those more aligned to where we did in a consulting engagement versus a true audit.
I got it. And I really like the way, I've seen more and more audit shops put more in kind of the back or an appendix, because we want to focus on, like you said, the audience. You want to have that executive summary at the beginning. How about ratings? Do you all rate yours? This is something, I think even the IIA standards, which are changing right now, are going to maybe require that rating for, overall not only overall, but then individual issues ratings. Do you guys do that today?
We don't, but I definitely see value in that because as a client who's trying to figure out what they're going to fix, you would think they're going to focus on those quick wins. Well, those are probably low risk areas typically. But no, we haven't incorporated that, but I definitely see where that's something that, like the IAA standards, it makes sense that we do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think what I want the students to get out of this is that communicating results can look and feel different regardless of where you work or depending on where you work. The report could be a report, it could be a memo. Like you said, there's shops doing video reports now. I've seen audit shops do some PowerPoint presentations instead of actually a formal Word document. So I do think this is one of those neat ways where the standards say we have to communicate our results, but they're not as prescriptive on how we have to do that. So I like that there's some creativity we can bring in here, but it does emphasize that not only verbal communication, but written communication are really important when it comes to internal audit.
Yeah, we're definitely looking at some more creative approaches because a lot of times, I mean, an audit report, you could be halfway through it and it's time, you're going to fall asleep because it's so boring. So we're trying to incorporate a lot of, infographics to tell the story. And I'm talking beyond just a pie chart to show it, but how can we take this narrative and put it in a picture so that the reader can get through it faster? Because our target audience is not only the government officials, it's also the taxpayer. And the taxpayer may not have a college education. So how can they understand what's going on in their government? And you talk about the PowerPoints, and that's something we're trying to do in our closeout meetings now, because we just have a short amount of time with this, senior leadership to be able to tell them what we saw. And so would a PowerPoint make more sense? So we're actually just starting to experiment with that and keeping in mind that it's a public record document. So is it consistent with the report? So I'll keep you up to speed on how that ends up turning out.
I love it. And that's perfect. We'll actually end there. I'll just mention that for any of the students watching this, if you are interested in the internal audit projects course, it's now called Risk Assurance and Advisory Engagements at MSU Denver. We audit the university and we do a PowerPoint presentation as kind of the main deliverable for that. So you also do a report, but honestly, I'm more concerned with what that PowerPoint presentation, because it does kind of live in infamy and go to the university leaders and the board. So if you are interested in that class, that's what we do in there too. So. But Stacey, thank you so much for talking to us about communicating our audit assurance or advisory findings. And we look forward to seeing you in another session.
Thank you for having me, Joe.